It's a real honor to be part of this colloquium. I begin by thanking Father Nathaniel, Professor Prodromou, and the Archdiocese for the invitation. It's an immense gift that we're able to gather to listen and learn from one another at this intersection of religion and global need, and I look forward to learning from all of you. In the world of global health and social justice across history, where I do most of my work, humanitarianism is commonly seen as more of a potential problem than a solution. In public health, humanitarianism usually means emergency disaster response, saving lives right now at any cost. And certainly, it's important to save lives. But humanitarian crisis response is often faulted for its inattention to respect for human rights and capabilities and failure to build solidarity assets of trust with the local community where long-term solutions must take shape. And yet I suspect from the program, the speakers so far, and our discussion that will range far more broadly here in these 2 days than the simple disaster assistance. Indeed, as political scientist Michael Barnett puts it, quote, "We live in a world of humanitarianisms, plural." And we've already seen that this morning. And whether they focus on instant fixes to save lives or efforts to remove the causes of suffering, religion plays an enormously influential role. But for many in the health field, this religious dominance is also a problem. Religions are known to be good at getting funds and volunteers, but a lot of people think they're not so good at effective and transparent administration and sensitivity at working together with other organizations. The fact is that whether humanitarianism is religious or not, it remains, as Barnett puts it, quote, "a morally complicated creature," one that too often makes choices based on the least bad of awful alternatives, these are his words, with funding, marketing, and response marked by good intentions that can lead to dreadful consequences. Many of you can likely describe far better than I how these dilemmas and tensions affect your own work. My task here is to point towards some essential attributes in Orthodox theological foundations that might help shape practical principles and choices in these issues. I'm going to focus on patristic texts as they relate to what we call economic, social, and cultural factors, particularly social determinants in poverty and health. But let us not forget, as Bishop Maxim has reminded us, that for those who wish to use these texts from a position of faith, they matter because they are rooted in the Trinity, in the incarnate Christ. And it is this theological root and the value of Christological embodiment through which such mindful use of these texts may ultimately take life. Now, I'm not going to flood you with quotes or long discussions of any specific example. What I'm going to do today is make some rather vast generalizations. These are ideas I've developed in detail elsewhere, and I'm happy to chat off camera or by email to help fill any gaps. The authors I draw most on, of course, are John Chrysostom and the Cappadocians, Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Cyprian of Carthage, Lactantius, Jacob of Sarug, and saints' lives such as that of Bishop Rabula of Edessa, and of course many others. As part of living tradition, their voices and the ideological tracings of their thought shape where we are today, not only within Orthodox Christianity, but also for many of us in our Western European and North American heritage, colonialism, and missionary philanthropy. What these authors say about aid to the needy is not a single-note melody of a solo liturgical cantor. It's instead a motley choir whose performance is marked by diversity in tone, note, and even key, as it hymns the social reality of incarnation, need, and theology of aid. We who hold these authors dear tend to see them as a crowded mix of old friends, esteemed colleagues, and suspicious characters. They are, like humanitarianism itself, morally complicated creatures. They manifest views on Christian ideals that may not perfectly match our own. For example, some among the patristic authors owned slaves, condoned inequitable treatment of women, and affirmed punitive norms like beating and torture, views that we reject as abusive and unjust, that were part of their culture. They did not necessarily agree about how much one ought to give away, who should do the giving, or who to give it to. If we want to walk or sing together with them, engaging with the exegetical narratives that their heirs have left us, we must be honest about flaws and dissonance, both theirs and our own. Yet certain common notes in their texts do resonate with our concerns today. I suggest we might group these commonalities into 4 themes, which I've called patristic ethics of aid. And language complicates any comparison of views that are preserved only in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, or Arabic. But again, here my focus is on generalizations. I'm going to summarize each of the 4 and then briefly look at one that I think merits more serious attention than it usually gets in many faith-based humanitarian discussions. But even as I parse out the 4, keep in mind that patristic authors don't pick and choose this or that, but offer us a conceptual construction based on a mix of related bits woven together from across these ideas. The first patristic ethic of aid is social justice. And here I think of the Hebrew tzedakah with its Syriac and Arabic cognates. Here, alms are inseparable from righteousness in the sense of social justice. Into this conceptual bucket, I would put Matthew 25:31-46, the parable of the sheep and goats, with its theology of Christ and the poor. The actions listed in this parable, feeding, clothing, visiting, medical ministry, etc., are sometimes called works of mercy, but the fact is there's nothing about mercy in this text. These are criteria for divine judgment, they're acts of righteousness, they're mandated divestments. Second, we find in a number of patristic texts a clear appeal to what we today call the equality of human rights. Such appeals are also related to social justice and righteousness. There's overlaps across these concepts, but the nuances are different enough that it's useful to keep them separate. Human rights are also, as I'm sure we all know, much more controversial than social justice or even sacred righteousness for many today, especially in religious discourse. More about this in a moment. Third, we find a strong theme of defining aid based on civic or kinship obligations. Here one is called to regard the other as a being toward whom we owe relational obligations. Patristic text frames such obligations in language about political governance, family, common humanity, shared citizenship in a heavenly kingdom, or communal neighborliness. We see this in Basil of Caesarea's sermons, and perhaps also in Chrysostom's famous image that Bishop Maxime has already quoted in his homily 20 on 2 Corinthians. In this text, the homeless poor in the streets are called Christ's body and the altar of God itself on which his audience ought to sacrifice. Thus, Chrysostom uses the incarnation to appeal to civic relational obligations to neighbors in the marketplace. The fourth common theme that runs through patristic texts is what most of us think of first. Indeed, many assume it's the only response to poverty, and that's charity, or some kind of one-sided material distribution based on an appeal to human sensibilities. It seems to me that using the word charity is too narrow and risks perpetuating some of the problems that make this approach into a stereotype that many people simply love to hate. In patristic sources, these concepts are also expressed using words such as gift, love, mercy, compassion, and philanthropia. I was struck earlier this week at a symposium at Brown on sacred song, for example, by Romanos's Kontakion on Elijah, where images of famine, hunger, and need are balanced against a just constantly repetitive refrain that affirms God as homonos philanthropos. I suggest we might group these various terms together by thinking of this fourth ethic through a focus not on charity, but rather on the virtue of imitating God's goodness, or loving kindness, the Hebrew chesed. For example, Gregory of Nyssa's first sermon on the love of the poor is more correctly titled On Good Works, in Euergetism. That is, material divestment is based on the theological idea that it imitates a virtue that essentially reflects the nature of God. We see this in Gregory of Nazianzus' best-known sermon on the poor, which we've already heard about, where he spends the first 5 chapters very explicitly comparing specific virtues. He concludes that the best of them is, quote, love of the poor, philotokios, and compassion and sympathy for our own flesh and blood, unquote. Again, we see overlapping words and concepts here. Now, as I'm sure you've guessed by now, my motive is not to say, okay, let's choose one, but to invite us to be deliberate about recognizing that all 4 of these are patristic themes that may shape our faith-based modern messages on aid. But one of the 4 calls for a little more comment, and that is the topic of human rights. Whenever human rights comes up in a religious discussion, people often jump reactively into heated debates over philosophy, history, types of rights, and indeed whether they exist at all. Such debate is not my intent here. Indeed, when I went online to learn more about the work of most of our speakers here, it was clear that some of you are already very active in promoting human rights. Rather, human rights matter to the discussion about theological foundations for two reasons. First, they're simply part of the aid conversation that we may have with NGOs and public health workers who share many of our common goals. If secular and ecumenical co-workers consider human rights important enough to understand, support, and advance, there's value for faith-based workers to know how to respectfully speak the language and how it connects with one's tradition, whether one agrees or not. In fact, the Matthew 25 parable makes it easy for us, with its focus on an almost identical list of activities as those we find in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights: food, clothing, the highest attainable standard of health, and safety and security in housing and economics. Whether we call them natural rights, relative entitlements, or embodied righteous social justice may not matter in the thick of things as much as our attitude as we affirm these rather similar ideals of moral obligations. Those of you trained in law might want to take the conversation further into ensuring that international legal rights are enforced, but that's another conversation. My point here is that we may draw on Christian roots to nurture constructive synergies between rights-based activists and faith-based humanitarian aid workers. The second reason rights matter to this discussion is because Christian leaders affirm that, not all of them, but there are those who affirm that rights ideas are indeed contained within foundational Christian texts. And these include a few patristic voices. While such conversations overlap with social justice narratives, we find at least some texts where specific human rights language stands out. For example, in Gregory of Nazianzus Oration 14, we find the term isotes, which one translator renders the justice of God, and isonomia, a Greek political term that could mean either equity or equality of rights. Appealing to the Garden of Eden before the fall, Gregory says, quote, "I would have you look back to our primary equality of rights, isonomia, not the later diversity." And Lactantius, the early 4th century tutor to Constantine's son Crispus, discusses social justice at length in his Divine Institutes, with an explicit appeal to human rights. Justice is at heart, he claims, an inseparable coherence of piety and equity, or fairness. As God divides his unique light equally between all, makes springs flow, supplies food and sleep, Lactantius says, so too, no one is a slave with him and no one is a master. For if he is the same Father to everyone, so are we all his children with equal rights, unquote. In fact, he says, the whole force of justice lies in the fact that everyone who comes into this human estate on equal terms is made equal by it. In Lactantius' world, justice, justitia, was a steady, enduring will to render to each their right or desert, and jus can also mean right. Lactantius expands on this in his book 6 on true worship. To act justly toward God is, he says, religion. To act justly toward other human beings is compassion or humanity. So clearly, for Lactantius also, rights were not limited to civic law, nor were they incompatible with soft virtues such as compassion. They were, for him, as in many lay discussions on modern rights today, part of an ethical argument. We are to treat others in this way, he argues, because it's something due to them as part of divine or existential justice, not because it's a law on the books, and not because it's an undeserved nicety that bubbles out of our good intentions. True justice, says Lactantius, is when we provide for the needy and the useless with food, hospitality, ransom for captives, health care for the sick, and provide strangers and paupers with decent burial. Although he might have used Constantine's new freedoms to leverage a Christian rhetoric to strengthen civil and political rights, this is not what he does. Instead, he focuses on basic material rights for the most socially vulnerable. Some modern ethicists also see human rights language in patristic sources. The conservative Protestant ethicist Nicholas Wolterstorff, for example, in Justice, Rights, and Wrongs, finds human rights language not only in Ambrose and Basil, but also in John Chrysostom, he says, I see no other way to interpret what John is doing with this powerful rhetoric than that he is reminding his audience, rich and poor alike, of the natural rights of the poor. The recognition of natural rights is unmistakably there. The poor are wronged because they do not have what is theirs by natural right, what they have a natural right to. That's Walterstorff. And Bastige Fortman, a Dutch Christian diplomat, argues that the biblical sources themselves suggest how, quote, the connection with religion may provide the necessary cultural basis for economic, social, and cultural rights. In conclusion, human rights, whether as inspirational ideal or as justiciable international law, are not, and I emphasize not, a cure-all for the world's problems. They are a tool. They have value to those who know how to use the tool in context and who respect the potential it offers for situations of inequity and need, even need in crisis. Within these limits, rights have a legitimate place in the Orthodox rhetoric of aid, given these hints of similar narrative threads in early patristic sources. I find it very encouraging that rights are such a recurrent theme in the websites of the organizations that so many of the panelists and speakers today represent. This may help signal the immense potential for Orthodox Christians who are active in humanitarianism to be and become exciting and positive agents for change. Orthodox praxis and liturgy draws on these early and formative theological voices, both men and women, in expressions with a particular power, beauty, and immediacy that may or may not be also found in other faith-based aid traditions. Insofar as patristic voices might speak hope into the dark places of our world, such hope calls for a more deliberate intentionality to dialogue with their ethical concepts about poverty and need. How we choose to draw on what I have created as 4 intersecting themes will likely depend on who we are and where we find ourselves. As Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, put it, the denial of rights is a terrible thing, and what takes time to learn is that the opposite of oppression is not a wilderness of litigation and reparation, but the nurture of concrete shared respect. Through such nurturing hope, let us work for changes about which we can now only dream. Thank you.